Well, to break it down for us, I'm joined by our international affairs editor, Philip Turle. Philip, will you first just remind us how this election works? What are people actually voting for?
Right, well, they're voting to renew the 720 members of the European Parliament. They're called MEPs, Member of the European Parliament, which is what it stands for. There are more this time round than there were the last time. There were 705. That's because Britain has quit the EU since 2019, which means that more seats can be given out to other countries. Within that, these MEPs are elected for a 5-year term, and it's only one vote which takes place in this Sunday. There are some countries have already voted before Sunday, but there's only one round of voting, universal suffrage. So in France, for example, in normal elections like legislative elections and presidential elections, there are 2 rounds of voting. This time round, there's only 1 round. The French authorities have been quite firm in saying, remember, there's only 1 round of voting, so if you miss it this Sunday, you won't be able to vote the following Sunday because there won't be a second round. Now, there are age limits on voting. Here in France, it is 18. That is the age limit for 22 of the 27 countries. But if you come, for example, from Austria, Belgium, Germany, or Malta, you can vote from the age of 16. And if you come from Greece, you can vote from the age of 17. That is something that's constantly under review about whether or not the voting age should be lowered. Even here in France, for the moment, that decision hasn't been taken. And of course, depending on the size of the country, some countries get more MEPs in the European Parliament than others. Like the one who gets the most MEPs is Germany, which has 96 at the moment. France has 79. The countries that have the fewest MEPs are Cyprus, Luxembourg and Malta, who only have 6 because they're small countries. So it's proportional to the size of the country from which you come. Now, the European Parliament sits in Strasbourg. Most of the EU business takes place in Brussels. And just one other thing which is quite interesting to note is that the voting in the European Parliament is the second biggest legislative election in the world after India. We've just been through all the Indian elections over 6 weeks. This election on this one day is involving 375 million potential voters across the EU, which makes it the second biggest in the world. So a huge domestic and democratic lot of policies and decision-making up for grabs that will be taken once the new parliament is elected.
Okay, so we're electing the MEPs, the members of the European Parliament. What kinds of decisions do they get to make compared to, say, members of a national parliament?
Right, well, they don't have any say in domestic policy, like, for example, what the French députés or what they will be called in English MPs. Domestic MPs would have business controlling, for example, the road network in France and speed limits and things like that. That's all domestic policy that can be taken from Paris. What the MEPs decide is, for example, over the EU budget, they can decide how much money agriculture is allotted through the CAP, which countries get more money than other countries. They can also be in charge of fishing, for example, in the EU fishing rights. They're the ones behind the Erasmus exchange program for students. Also, they're involved in communications across the EU. So there is this huge budget, 170 billion euros in 2022. They're also in charge of directives. Now, directives are not laws that are enforced in EU countries. Directives are proposals that are put forward to the different nations within the EU, directing them to take the necessary steps within their domestic governments to introduce those measures. The EU Parliament can also choose the head of the European Commission. Currently, Ursula von der Leyen, whose job is up for renewal. Will she get it renewed or not? That is something we'll find out after these EU elections are over. There are several different movements within the EU Parliament. The European People's Party is the largest, but there's also the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, Renew Europe, the Greens, the Conservatives, and Identity and Democracy, one of the far-right groups.
And you mentioned the fact that the EU institutions are split between the Commission, which meets in Brussels, and then the EU Parliament in Strasbourg. Can you explain why that is?
Well, basically, this all goes back to the start of the EU when it was all based in Luxembourg, and what was originally called the European Coal and Steel Community had their headquarters in Luxembourg, but they used to use what was known as the meeting room of the Council of Europe, which was in Strasbourg, and the Council of Europe let them use that meeting room. And that's why there is still the Parliament in Strasbourg. All the other business takes place now in Brussels, which was equally divided between Germany, the United Kingdom, and France. So that was why Brussels was chosen. And I think France is quite pleased that it does take place. The European Parliament is in Strasbourg because it's on French territory, which means that France can keep an eye on what's going on there more easily.
All right, Philip, breaking down the EU institutions, always complicated for us, but you make it quite clear. Thank you so much for that. That's our international affairs editor there, Philip Turle.